Day. I make this program today in the aftermath of the conversation between Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu, and the various repercussions that have flowed from that. Suffice to say, and I'm going to return to this later in this program, I think that my guess that the conversation between President Xi Jinping and President Biden the other day on the 2nd of April, that was in some way connected with the Lecornu-Shoigu conversation. I think the evidence now is strengthening that theory, though I will, as I said, return to that later in this program. Anyway, before I discuss the West's diplomatic outreach to the Russians again, or rather the lack of an intelligent Western diplomatic outreach to the Russians, let me first of all do what I often do, which is discuss the military situation in Ukraine as it is this morning. And the events now are happening at an ever-accelerating pace. So over the last couple of days, we've had reports about Russian troops reaching the gates of Chasiv Yar, or at least the eastern suburb of Chasiv Yar, located east of the Chasiv Yar Canal. And I've now seen film of this outlying suburb. It's a typical Soviet-era micro-district, such as the Soviets often built on the outskirts of their towns and cities. The main town in this context being not Chasiv Yar actually, but Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as the Soviets called it, even though, of course, this particular micro-district is included within the municipality of Chasiv Yar itself. To reiterate again, Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk, is at the core of what is actually quite a significant conurbation. It includes places like Kurdyumovka, Bogdanovka, Khromovo, Chasiv Yar itself, Opytnoye. All of these places, they are sort of far-flung little villages, but they're not really villages so much as outlying suburbs of the Bakhmut-Artyomovsk conurbation. And of course, Chasiv Yar ultimately is part of that. Now, I should say that the film makes it quite clear to me that in terms of its area, this micro-district east of the Chasiv Yar Canal is actually very small. Capturing it, once the Russians break into it, well, it might be a difficult and protracted affair, but I suspect that once the collapse comes, it will come fast. And there does seem to be an area of ground between this micro-district and the Chasiv Yar Canal, and I would have thought that it would be difficult even now for the Ukrainians to send troops and reinforcements and supplies across the canal to the micro-district. They would be doing so over open ground, very vulnerable to attack from Russian drones and artillery systems and even aircraft that are now probably operating heavily over the airspace in this area. I would add that there doesn't seem to be much in the way of air defense for the Ukrainian troops in this area. So anyway, the Russians have arrived at the gates of this micro-district. And there was a lot of talk that because of the extensive minefields that the Ukrainians have laid, that it would take a very long time before the Russians were in a position to attack this micro district. And I discussed all of that in a program a couple of days ago, and I went along with that theory because, well, I'm not the sort of person who would know otherwise. And, well, already the information is starting to look out of date because this morning we got news that the Russians have actually advanced into the micro district itself. And there is a fascinating video that shows the Russian attack. And you can find this video, by the way, on Dima's Military Summary channel. He provides a running account explaining what you see in the video. It's actually quite a fascinating and dramatic video. I wonder how it was made. I'm guessing it must have been made from a Russian drone. But it shows a group of 8 vehicles moving at great speed up several roads. Then the vehicles move in different directions. One moves towards Chasov Yar and apparently lands troops in the southern part of Chasov Yar, perhaps occupying a building there. I'm going to guess one of the high-rise residential complexes with which this micro district, is made up. But the others move north. The other 7 vehicles move north into a forested area. This is one of those places. The specific forested area was supposed to be heavily mined. But apparently the Russian troops from these 7 armored vehicles went into the forested area, and the assumption is that they're in the process of clearing whatever Ukrainian troops still are present in that forested area. And as has been pointed out by several people, Dima specifically, if the Russians are able to occupy this forested area, then that will put them in a very strong position to attack this micro district from the north, as well as the existing attack, which is being carried out from the south. Now, I'm going to make a number of very quick observations, and these are my own observations. One can accept them or not, as one chooses. The vehicles, these 8 vehicles, move at extraordinary speed. They're obviously wheeled vehicles moving at very fast speeds down metalled roads. And I'm going to make a guess that they are the Tiger vehicles that are part of the Russian airborne forces. So this is probably paratroopers moving at great speed. And the speed actually provides protection because it's clearly very difficult for Ukrainian FPV drones to attack these vehicles because they're moving so fast. And on top of that, it's probably very difficult for the artillery, Ukrainian artillery. And one does see some sort of shells exploding, though not many, it must be said, close to where, along the roads where these vehicles are moving. Anyway, it's probably very difficult for the artillery, Ukrainian artillery as well, to attack, to destroy these 8 vehicles. Suffice to say that so far as I can see, all 8 vehicles, the 7 that moved to the north into the forested area, and the one that moved to the south into Chasiv Yar itself, seem to have reached their destinations without incident. Now, that might be, by the way, a sign of things to come. It could be that one plan that the Russians have to deal with the problem of FPV drones is to do something like this in future. Instead of using tracked vehicles, which are heavily armored but rather slow, to advance in particular directions, advance using wheeled vehicles along roads at very high speed, making it difficult for the FPV drone operators to keep up with them, and for what remains of Ukraine's artillery to damage and attack these wheeled vehicles. I suspect that earlier in the war, operations of that kind would not have been possible. The Ukrainian artillery densities would have been too great. I think that using light vehicles, wheeled vehicles, to launch assaults in this way would have been too dangerous. But now that the Ukrainian artillery has been severely thinned, it might make sense. Anyway, that's just me. I'm just saying that people with tactical knowledge and understanding of these things are free to come back and prove and show me that I am wrong. Anyway, the fact is that the Russians do seem to have occupied at least one building, perhaps an apartment complex, in Chasov Yar, but as Dima at the Military Summary channel correctly says, the main attack was clearly on this forested area, and it's starting to look as if all the stories about the dense minefields might have been somewhat exaggerated. Anyway, the Russians are in this forested area to the northeast of Chasiv Yar, and of course, to the northeast of Chasiv Yar lies the bitterly contested and fought over village of Bogdanovka. Back in the autumn, it looked as if the Russians were focused on capturing Bogdanovka. There was massive amounts of fighting there. There was a lot of claims that after Khromovo was captured, another village closer to Bakhmut, that the Russians would move on to capture Bogdanovka. And then, as so often happens in the war, the Russians did the unexpected. Instead of focusing on Bogdanovka, they switched and changed the emphasis to Ivanivska and to the open ground, where actually it's not open ground, the ground to the west of Bakhmut, which is actually heavily forested, apparently filled with Ukrainian defense lines and positions and trenches. There's a cemetery there as well. There's the famous Popovka forest, all of that area. That actually turned out to be the area that the Russians were much more focused on than Bogdanovka itself. The attack on Bogdanovka, as has proved so often to be the case, was a feint. It made the Ukrainians think that the main attack towards Chasov Yar was going to happen through Bogdanovka, and instead the real attack came from a completely different direction. Anyway, it does seem that now with the cemetery, the Popovka forest, the Dacha area immediately to the west of Bakhmut, with all of these territories and places captured, with the Russians capturing the forest to the northwest of Chasiv Yar itself, with the Russians at the gates of Chasiv Yar, it does seem as if Ukrainian resistance in Bogdanovka is now collapsing. And there's apparently a film. Dima has shown it. There's one in which we see the arm of a Ukrainian soldier jutting out of a building, apparently in Bogdanovka, waving a white flag, in other words, indicating his intention to surrender. There's apparently reports of mass surrenders in Bogdanovka by Ukrainian soldiers. We have to be careful about this because I've seen no actual footage that this is the case. But it's likely one way or the other, with the Russians now well to the west of Bogdanovka, that the Ukrainians are now gradually abandoning this village. And it seems that this is true elsewhere, with the Russians now at the gates of Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians are pulling their troops back from places like Kleshevka, Andreevka, all of these places. We don't yet have full details, and the maps that the various mappers are providing us are still incomplete, but it does seem as if the Ukrainians understand that with Ivanivska lost and with the Russians now outside Chasiv Yar itself, and in fact breaking into Chasiv Yar, or at least this eastern suburb or micro district of Chasiv Yar, that they have to pull their troops back from these outlying villages, places that have been fought over so bitterly for over a year now, places like Kleshevka, Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, all of these places, and that they have to finally accept that the battle for these villages has been finally and irretrievably lost, and that the Russians are going to soon be in complete control of all of them. Anyway, there we go. So the Battle of Chasiv Yar seems to be underway. It's still, and I think this is fair to say, very much in its early stages. It may be that the Russians will be able to capture the micro district east of the canal very fast. As I said, in terms of its area, it is relatively small. Obviously, there are high-rise buildings which can be effective fortifications, but the Russians have shown in places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka that they can smash through these fortifications in these high-rise buildings. Once they reach them and get amongst them, they have used tanks on the ground to blast Ukrainian defenses in the basements and ground floors of these buildings. And of course, they have their Air Force now with its immensely powerful aerial bombs, which they can also deploy against these buildings. And one way or the other, as I said, if the fighting does move into this micro district itself, then it's likely that the Russians will be able to capture it fairly quickly. The main part of Chasiv Yar, however, lies beyond the canal. I personally have no doubt now that the Russians do intend its capture. That is going to be, I think, a much more complex affair. Firstly, the Russians have to get beyond the canal. That might not be in all places a particularly easy thing to do. They not only need to get beyond the canal, but they need to keep their troops who passed beyond the canal supplied. And of course, that means supplying troops beyond a water obstacle. And on top of that, it seems that Chasiv Yar is on a hill. The area, at least the built-up area of Chasiv Yar, west of the canal, is on a hill. I've seen claims that it is a hill that is 150 meters tall. I find that very difficult to believe. I wonder whether that's an error and whether, in fact, it's perhaps 150 feet tall or something of that kind. I mean, talking about it as being 150 meters tall makes it sound like a small, well, like a very large hill indeed. But anyway, one way or the other, it's going to be a difficult place to capture. But the Russians are in overwhelming force. There have been various claims at various times that they have up to 100,000 men concentrated in this area. They have total aerial dominance. They are able to interdict communications. They, as I said, probably control the roads with their drones. If they put their mind to the capture of Chasiv Yar, I have no doubt at all that though it may take them some time, They will do it. By the way, that is true of all of the various places that we've been hearing about over the last few weeks. Places like Sinkovka, near Kupiansk, Kupiansk itself, Terni, Belogorodka, which we'll come to shortly, Rabotino, which has been fought over in Zaporozhye region, Novomikhailovka, all of these places, if the Russians are taking their time to capture them, it's not because the Russians aren't able to capture these places. It is because they're giving other places more priority and they're not committing the full force of their forces to do so. Any one of these villages the Russians can capture if they commit the necessary resources, which they have, to do it. And I think this is something that needs to be understood and acknowledged, because without that understanding and acknowledgement, all comprehension of what is taking place on these battlefields goes out of the window and is wrong. Anyway, a major crisis for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar. And by the way, this is cutting through in the West. I'm now reading more and more reports across the West about the crisis in Chasiv Yar. For some reason, whereas people in the West perhaps are not particularly interested about what happens in Pervomaisky, for example, even though Pervomaisky is a much bigger place than Chasiv Yar, or Krasnogorovka, which is a place roughly the same size as Chasiv Yar. The people in the West don't seem to be very interested in what goes on in those two towns. Chasiv Yar, close to Bakhmut, astride the main railway and road lines, a place on a hill, a place which apparently Western officials and officers and military people know very well because many of them have been there. An important deployment place, a place that is now understood to be the hinge of Ukrainian defenses in north-central Donbass. Anyway, the fight for Chasiv Yar is starting to cut through. By the way, all these reports, which I'm now reading in the media in the West, talking about the strategic importance of Chasiv Yar, why Chasiv Yar's fall would be critical for Ukraine. Well, what they indirectly do is provide further demolition of that universal trope that I was reading and hearing last year, at this time last year, about Bakhmut, that Bakhmut was of no strategic, only symbolic importance. As we see, that was wrong. David Gantz, the great historian of the Eastern Front during the Second World War, has explained how Bakhmut was the pivot of Field Marshal Manstein's German defense of Donbass from the Red Army during the Second World War. But we also see now how the loss of Bakhmut has opened the way for the Russians to move to Chasiv Yar. If Chasiv Yar falls and the entire Bakhmut conurbation comes under Russian control, then even Western commentators now acknowledge that will be a critical situation for Ukraine. Well, there we go. So that's the situation in Chasiv Yar. In other places, the news for Ukraine is equally bad. And there are now several places where the Russians are mounting their offensive. But it's important to stress that their main offensive continues to be in central Donbass. And if we move north of the Bakhmut area of Chasiv Yar, there's major events apparently now starting to take place around Siversk. I said a few days ago that it seemed to me that the Russians have now launched their true assault on this village of Belogorovka, which is the one inhabited or formerly inhabited position in Lugansk region, still under Ukrainian control. The Russians controlled it for a certain period in 2022, but they lost control of it in the face of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022. Anyway, the Russians have made various attacks towards Belogorovka over the course of March. There's been many claims by the Ukrainians that they've repelled all of those attacks successfully. I said that, in my opinion, they were reconnaissances in force and feints to understand and wear down the Ukrainian defenses. A couple of days ago, the Russians began a major advance on the southern flanks of Belogorovka, moving towards encircling this village. There are now reports that they have entered or perhaps even occupied a factory district to the north of Belogorovka. It looks as if these reports are correct, that Belogorovka has been taken in a vice, and it's likely, one would like to assume, that the Ukrainians will at some point pull back from it. And of course, if Belogorovka falls, the next inhabited settlement to the west of Belogorovka is the town of Siversk, around 10,000 people before the war, another fortified position. The Russians are located to the north of Siversk. In fact, they've been there since 2022. But the Russians are also now closing in on Siversk from the south. There's reports that they've managed to capture a significant amount of territory south of Siversk. They seem to be preparing an assault on the village of Rozdolovka to the south of Siversk. And they're also advancing up a railway line. And there's a bitter battle for a railway station along this railway line. And anyway, one way or the other, with the Russians now very active in the area of Siversk, it's looking like the ring around Siversk also is closing. Well, all that is dramatic enough, not perhaps as dramatic as what we're seeing in Chasov Yar, but the other place where big news is happening is in the Avdiivka area. Now, I have finally found a clear map which gives me a sense of the geography of this area and of what exactly is happening. So it's clear that the Russians have captured the northern part of Pervomaisky. This includes a little further to the east of the northern part of Pervomaisky, the village of Vodyane, which is to the west of Opytnoye, which the Russians have controlled for some time. There is actually, rather confusingly, a district of Pervomaisky, the area north of the reservoir, which is also called Vodyane. This is a common feature of this landscape. Places, often adjoining places, have identical names. Anyway, this place, this area, the northern part of Vodyane has this northern part of Pervomaisky, north of the reservoir, also called Vodyane, has also been captured by the Russians. The Ukrainians launched 2 counterattacks to try to drive the Russians back from this northern part of Pervomaisky, this place called Vodyane. Both of those attacks were apparently defeated by the Russians. The Ukrainians continue to cling on to some areas to the south within Pervomaisky, And there are some reports also that the Ukrainians have been trying to launch a counterattack towards the village of Nivolskoy, which, of course, the Russians captured from them some weeks ago. So the Ukrainians, instead of pulling out of Pervomaisky, as some had expected, and as would undoubtedly have been the sensible thing to do, are instead trying to reinforce and hold on to their positions there. It is the consistent pattern that the Ukrainians follow. Instead of pulling back to more defendable positions, they reinforce failure by holding on, clinging on to undefendable locations. This then, of course, enables various people to come onto threads in my videos and threads in various people's Twitter feeds and things like that, and talk about how long it is taking for the Russians to capture these places. And of course, it does prolong the time before the Russians capture these places. But of course, all it does, and it's the point, by the way, that those Ukrainian officers were making to Politica, all it does is that it increases the scale of Ukrainian losses and compounds the defeat, the eventual defeat. It's very strange that this fact is so little understood or accepted. There's been many reports about how Ukraine is running out of equipment and men. More about that soon. But it seems strange that people, including, it would seem, the Ukrainian political leadership, don't seem to make the connection between the fact that they're defending, beyond all reason, undefendable places and throwing away men and machines and ammunition to no purpose, and the fact that they are, in fact, running out of men and ammunition and machines. Anyway, north of Pervomaisky, it is turning into a Ukrainian collapse, and it's now generally acknowledged that the Russians have reached certain important villages that they need to take to break through the Ukrainian defenses further, so that they're apparently reached and are now outside the town, the small town of Umanska and the village of Yasnobrodovka, which of course to the west of Orlovka and Toninka. This is where the Ukrainians are trying to make their next stand. They're also present in yet another village called Netailovo. They're also trying to defend that particular village. But there are reports that the Russians have already broken through these defenses, that they might even be fighting within Umanska itself. And if so, then, to say it simply, the whole position of the Ukrainians west of Avdiivka is becoming critical. And there are very confusing reports about Berdichi, the situation in Berdichi and Semenyovka, north of Orlovka. There were some claims a few days ago that the Russians had captured Berdichi. It seems more likely that the Ukrainians are still clinging on to parts of Berdichi. But I said previously that with the Russians apparently now outside Umanska, which is well to the west of Berdichi, Ukrainian lines of retreat from Berdichi are already going to be severely threatened. And so, by the way, it is turning out. And today there's been a comment about the situation, which is clearly about Ukrainian positions in Semenovka and Berdichi from Igor Kimakovsky, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government. And he says this: now the developments near Avdiivka indicate that the Ukrainian army grouping in the frontline area has all the chances of being cut into two parts, which will simplify the operation of our assault troops. Kimakovsky told TASS that the Ukrainian military had withdrawn some troops from the settlements of Berdichi and Semyonovka near Avdiivka due to the threat of encirclement. He did not rule out that the Ukrainian army could deploy its withdrawn units to other frontline areas in the Avdiivka direction. And what Kimakovsky seems to be saying is that there is now real risk that if the Ukrainians continue to cling on to Berdichi and Semyonovka, with the Russians now having basically broken through to Manska, that the Ukrainians themselves could be encircled in Berdichi and Semyonovka, which is, of course, exactly what the Russian newspaper Avdiivka was telling us a few days ago. So a critical situation for the Ukrainians in this particular area, and a rapidly deteriorating one. Elsewhere, the Russians seem to be gaining more and more territory further south around Novomykhailovka. I've said that, contrary to all expectations, and in my opinion, logical sense, the Ukrainians still seem to be trying to cling on to the western buildings in Novomykhailovka. The Russians are well to the west of these positions in the south. They seem to be moving and occupying ground to the north. I would have thought that there is now a very real possibility that Ukrainian troops in Novomykhailovka, the remaining troops in Novomykhailovka, will be encircled, by which I mean trapped, if this continues for much longer. It seems that nonetheless, Ukraine, Zelensky and Syrskyi continue to send in reinforcements to try to hold this area of Novomykhailovka. Admitting to the fall of Novomykhailovka is apparently unacceptable, and the result is more Ukrainian troops are being killed, wounded every day, holding an undefendable position, are now at serious risk of encirclement. And in the meantime, as the Ukrainians overcommit for trying to defend themselves in Novomykhailovka, the Russians further south are edging ever closer towards the roads that link Novomykhailovka and other places to Vuhledar. Further south, they look poised, in fact, to cut some of these roads. And even as they do that, they have been renewing their very heavy bombing and artillery strikes of Vuhledar, the southern fortress town, which is the hinge of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass. So that, it seems to me, is the overall military situation. Of course, there is fighting going on in other places. There's lots of reports that the Russians are gradually, methodically edging back towards Staromayorsk and Urozhaine in the Vremivka salient area, that they are creeping towards the road the Ukrainians use to supply their troops in Rabotino, and that they're gradually clearing the fields east of Rabotino, nibbling away at what's left of Bradley Square. But as I said, the main battles clearly happening in this area between Marinka, or to be more precise, between Novomikhailovka and Siversk. The main focus of the battle are the territories west of Avdiivka and west of Bakhmut. The immediate objectives of the Russians are Chasov Yar and Pervomaisky, and the Russians are steadily and cumulatively gaining ground on taking both. And to repeat once more, once all of these fortified towns around Donetsk city and in central Donbass are captured by the Russians, the ground opens up, there's much more space to maneuver, the area becomes less built up, and the Dnieper is there in the distance, coming within possible reach. So we can see what is happening. This major set of fortified positions which the Ukrainians created in Donbass after the 2014 fighting is now increasingly being taken apart. Well, that wasn't the only news on the battlefronts yesterday, or at least in the war yesterday. The Russians also launched a major drone strike across Ukraine. Dima at the military summary channel says that it was mainly focused on attacking along the railways, attacking railways connections and stations and railway depots and that kind of thing, presumably intended to complicate and slow down Ukraine's movement of troops. This sort of thing goes on every night now. The point is that the Russians slowly, methodically, continue to take the Ukrainians apart, preparing perhaps for that big knockout blow that the West fears they're going to launch sometime in the summer. Well, let's now turn to some of the commentaries and discussions and debates about what to do about the situation that we now have in the West. Well, the first thing to say is that we've now had a very interesting article in the Financial Times telling us about the kind of things that Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been telling the NATO allies. And it makes fascinating reading. It seems that the reason that the Russians are advancing on every front is because of China. And the article reads, Antony Blinken warns allies of deepening Chinese support for Russia. And the article goes on to say that the US has warned its European allies that China is deepening its support for Russia's military-industrial complex with assistance that is both helping its invasion of Ukraine and threatening other countries. Tony Blinken used meetings with EU and NATO foreign ministers this week to warn that Beijing is assisting Moscow at a concerning scale, and that's a quote, providing tools, inputs, and technical expertise, according to three people familiar with the discussion. They quoted Blinken as saying the assistance was particularly focused on Russia's production of optical equipment and propellants and its space sector, which he said not only contributes to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but threatens other countries. And we're told, there's a quote, the warnings were explicit, there's been a shift, and it was felt in the room. This was a new development, it was very striking. And we go on to read from the Financial Times, Western countries have imposed dozens of rounds of sanctions and trade embargoes in a bid to cripple its economy, starve it of military supplies, and halt its 2-year war against Ukraine. But Moscow has been able to keep its economy running and scale up its defense industry, thanks in large part to expanded trade with China, imports from third countries of so-called dual-use goods that can be used to make weapons, and direct military supplies from North Korea and Iran. Notice that no reference is made here to India, which is, of course, now one of Russia's major trade partners, and not just India, but of course Turkey as well. But anyway, to move on. Russia's ability to dramatically increase production of arms, particularly artillery shells, missiles, and kamikaze drones, has spooked Western capitals as they scramble to increase their own defense output in order to give Kiev a chance to withstand Moscow's onslaught. And this is where we come back to my point yesterday, that it looked to me, and it was suggested, based on suggestions that have been appearing in the Chinese media, passed on to me by Sofia Midkiff and others, that the conversation between President Biden and President Xi Jinping on the 2nd of April, that was all about ultimately Ukraine, or to be more precise, China's supposed help to Russia. And in fact, that's what we are now told. And we're told that, this is in the Financial Times, that President Biden raised the issue directly with President Xi Jinping in a phone call on Tuesday. The White House said Biden voiced concerns about China's support for Russia's defense industrial base and its impact on European and transatlantic security. And we're also told that speaking before the call, a senior US official said Washington had seen China start to help to rebuild Russia's defense industrial base, essentially backfilling the trade from European partners. One person familiar with the situation said the Biden administration was particularly concerned about the provision of propellant for missiles, and that this is all being supplied by China to Russia, and that Biden's call to Xi Jinping was all about this. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, to say it straightforwardly, an awful lot of this looks to me like nonsense. Undoubtedly, Chinese-Russian trade has expanded massively over the last 2 years, though it must be said that it has been on a firm upward trajectory for a very long time. But, just to give an example, it is bizarre to suggest that the Russians, with a massive chemical industry of their own, with a major space program of their own, with a big rocket industry, would have to rely on China, for example, to supply rocket fuel. I mean, there's no evidence of this. Nothing of that kind that I know about appears to be true. It's plausible that China, for example, has supplied machine tools to Russia. The Russians undoubtedly are buying machine tools from China. The Russians are buying microchips from China. There's no secret about that, and that's been underway for a very long time. But to suggest that the entirety of Russian military industrial production is due to China is far-fetched, to say the least. What the Americans are doing here, what Biden was trying to do on the 2nd of April, is that he was trying to put pressure on Xi Jinping. He was basically hinting to Xi Jinping that unless Xi Jinping took steps to rein Putin in, to force the Russians to the negotiating table, then the Americans and their European allies would start to crack down on China, would start imposing more and more sanctions on China, and they would justify that on the basis of the allegation of China's supply of dual-use technologies and trade and industrial products to Russia. And as is absolutely clear from the Chinese readout, the one I discussed yesterday, Xi Jinping blew Biden a raspberry. He said, no, this is not something we're going to be intimidated or pressured about. Our trade, our relationship with Russia is our business. It's not yours. And I think that is going to remain the Chinese position. Now, here I think a very important point needs to be understood by people in the West. I don't think it is understood by governments in the West or political commentators in the West. I think there is a strange idea that the smooth movement of trade between China and the West is of greater importance to the Chinese leadership than the relationship with Russia. I think that seriously underestimates the strategic importance to China of its partnership with Russia. Quite apart from the fact that the Chinese undoubtedly are sympathetic to the Russians over the specific issue of the crisis in Ukraine. I think on any hard-headed analysis of Chinese self-interest, it ought to be obvious that with China certain to face increasing pressure from the West, they need a strong, friendly Russia at their back, and they will not take steps that might jeopardize that long-term relationship. That Western governments seem to find this so difficult to understand, I find strange, but there it is. Anyway, this attempt to pressure Xi Jinping was clearly connected. And, I say that, I don't know that for a fact, but it seems to me that logically it was connected with this attempt to reach out to the Russians and to get the Russians to agree to some kind of a conflict freeze. Now, here I think we can go back to the Russian readout of the conversation between Shoigu and Lerkonu, because it's clear to me that what the West is now aiming for, what Tony Blinken, in particular, the Tony Blinken faction of the US government is aiming for, is not a revival of the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. It is something that falls significantly short of that. Firstly, it wants the Russians to go back to the 2022 start lines. That is something that Zelensky, through gritted teeth, appears to have agreed to. He's resisted every inch of the way, but he seems to have very grudgingly agreed with what the Americans are telling him to agree to on that. And the question of Ukraine's future membership of NATO, apparently that is still not open to discussion with the Russians. What the Americans basically want is a freeze of the conflict along the 2022 lines, the Russians surrendering all of Zaporozhye and Kherson region, Mariupol, Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, all of these places, handing them back to the Ukrainians, and the Americans and the Europeans free thereafter to have all of Ukraine minus Crimea and the territory of the two breakaway Donbass republics as they existed pre-2022. Anyway, the Americans working towards getting all of that of Ukraine as soon as possible into NATO. Not now. We're told that the Germans and the Americans in particular are strongly opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership. At present, whilst the war is underway, because of course they do not want to be put in a position where Ukraine can cite Article 5 of the Washington Treaty and ask for the West's support in the ongoing war Ukraine is engaged in with Russia. But eventually, once the Russians agree to this conflict freeze. And I suspect, in fact I am sure, that that is the proposal that Logistical basically floated to the Russians. And of course, Shoigu batted it away. He said that is completely unacceptable. He said that, at the very least, the starting point of the negotiations must be the proposals that were discussed in Istanbul, which, by the way, cover the whole of Donbass, but that will only be the starting point of the discussions. Now, of course, the French are denying that the question of a peace settlement for Ukraine, for the conflict, the existing conflict, was discussed at all. They're suggesting that the only purpose of Logistica's call was to discuss the attack on Crocus City Hall, and with an offer by France to share information with the Russians about that attack. I'm going to say straightforwardly that I believe the Russians on this one. The call makes absolutely no sense at all if it was purely about Crocus City Hall. The Russians say that it was an urgent call, that the French badgered them to accept the call, and the French would not have just called in order to share intelligence about Crocus City Hall, intelligence which the Russians anyway are not interested in and are not accepting. By the way, on that topic, there has actually been more information coming from the investigative committee, the Russian investigative committee, about Crocus City Hall, the attack on Crocus City Hall. The Russians are now saying that they've managed to examine the mobile phones of the four gunmen. They found pictures showing Ukrainian flags and Ukrainian soldiers and all sorts of things in those phones. You can believe that information or not, as you choose, but that is what the Russians currently are saying. So I've no doubt that this was a diplomatic outreach. I suspect that the French have been sending, on the Americans' behalf, signals of this kind to the Russians for some time. It's the same proposal that Richard Haass and the Council for Foreign Relations people in Washington have been floating for the better part of a year. The Russians have repeatedly made clear that they are not interested in this proposal. And as Putin has said, why would they agree a ceasefire merely because the other side is out of ammunition? And that now brings us back to the reality of the war, because of course, as we see, the Russians are advancing. It's likely that at some point within the next few weeks or months, they will take Chasov Yar. Perhaps the collapse will come sooner. Events do seem to be moving at an ever faster pace on the battlefronts. Battles that used to take a year seem to take a few months. Before long, they will probably just be taking a few weeks. And of course, we have all these rumors and concerns that the Russians are building up their forces to a massive degree, and maybe preparing for a huge advance on Ukraine, an offensive in the summer. Kurt Campbell, the US official who has now been appointed Deputy Secretary of State, taking the job temporarily occupied by Victoria Nuland. He's now given a report to the, I think it's Council for the New American Century, a particularly notorious neocon outfit, just saying. Anyway, interesting that he should have addressed them. Anyway, Kurt Campbell has given a bleak picture of the situation. He's directly contradicted Lloyd Austin's claim that the Russians are going to be weakened by this war. He says that the Russians have successfully reconstituted their military. They seem to be stronger than ever. Even Kurt Campbell can see that. He praises the pluck and courage of the Ukrainians, but he understands that the Russians have become stronger. He also laments the dreadful state of the United States' own military-industrial complex, though he doesn't seem to acknowledge the reality that even as the Russians have, as he puts it, reconstituted their military, the United States and its allies are now desperately short of every single type of equipment that matters for this war. Shells, President Pavel's plan to buy shells in the international arms market, already a recognition and admission of a huge crisis in shell production and shell stockpiles within NATO. No more deliveries, apparently, for some time now of tanks, at least Western tanks, to Ukraine. Not that the Western tanks that the West has supplied to Ukraine have performed especially well. Western artillery, all those guns that have been supplied to Ukraine, more and more of them being destroyed all the time. Lots of reports that a lot of them are becoming all but inoperable because the barrels are wearing out and that problem can't be fixed. Anyway, no more supplies. There hadn't been any supplies of those kind of things for a very long time either. The Germans now say that they're on a hunt around the world to find Ukraine more Patriot missiles. Well, Patriot missiles are already in desperate supply. The United States knows where all the Patriot missiles are because, of course, they supply them to most countries. I believe the only other country that makes Patriot missiles are Japan. And I think the Japanese, I think I'm right in saying that the Japanese keep all their production of Patriot missiles to themselves. So it shouldn't actually be difficult to find where the Patriot missiles are. Problem is, there aren't that many of them. And as we have seen, as has now been clearly demonstrated, the Russians are able to destroy Patriot missile launchers at great speed, incredibly fast, and there is no defense. The Patriot missiles are not able to defend Ukraine against Russia's hypersonic missiles. It's questionable whether they have ever been effective in defeating the Kinjal missiles, and they certainly cannot, despite some claims from Ukraine, they certainly cannot counter the new Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles that the Russians are now deploying on the battlefields. So all of these problems are starting to mount, and of course there's also problems with manpower as well. The Ukrainians desperately short of men. Recently, Zelensky lowered the draft age from 27 to 25, but this is to some extent apparently a symbolic act because there is no actual mobilization law which so far authorizes Ukraine to enlist men from the age of 25. Now, having said that, apparently there are not that many of these men to start with anyway. Many of them have left Ukraine already. A Ukrainian MP is complaining that the mere talk of the mobilization law has been so destabilizing to the Ukrainian economy, causing young men to leave, money to be taken out of Ukraine, accelerating capital outflow, all of those things. Anyway, all of that, that it's actually done more damage to Ukraine's economy than the war itself. Of course, I don't take that claim seriously. But anyway, that is what he said. But so far, no sign of that mobilization law coming into force. There are rumblings from the United States that Senate Speaker Johnson of the House of Representatives is finally cracking, that the pressure from the administration and from the McConnell wing of the party is becoming so intense that he's now trying to find some way of putting forward an aid package for Ukraine to the House at some point within the next few weeks. This could convert the entire $61 billion from an appropriation to a loan which, of course, Ukraine is never going to repay. In fact, by adding to the aggregate level of Ukraine's liabilities, it will, I suspect, mean that Ukraine is technically insolvent. There's been concerns expressed about Ukraine's likely insolvency fairly soon by the World Bank. The World Bank, in effect, gave Ukraine a further loan of $1.5 billion, but is expressing all kinds of alarms about the underlying situation of Ukraine's economy. But anyway, put all that aside, Speaker Johnson does now seem to be gradually edging towards approving in some form or other this appropriation. There is pushback. Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other populist Republicans who oppose this aid package are furious with him. There's suggestions that if he goes ahead, they will move to remove him as Speaker. That might give him pause, who's to say? But it's becoming again more likely that this aid package will eventually pass. But we go back to that article that appeared a few days ago in Politico, sourced from those Ukrainian military officers. They themselves said that if this appropriation passes, it is not going to make a difference. It is not going to change the outcome of the war. One wonders, again, why so much time is being spent on this subject of this appropriation when the dynamics, the actual realities of the war itself are so critically bad. So, what are the plans of the Western powers to get themselves out of this situation? Well, there is the one which is to suggest to the Russians a conflict freeze and to lean on the Chinese to get them to lean on the Russians to get the Russians to accept a conflict freeze. That, to repeat again, is a total non-starter. The other is Macron's idea of sending troops to Ukraine. And that has now been endorsed by none other than Edward Luttwak, that famous grand strategist in the United States, the person who comes up with all sorts of talk. He writes and discusses war extensively. I can remember way back in 1999, by the way, that he was one of those people who actually criticized NATO's eastward expansion. And he was also very critical at that time of the US bombing war on Yugoslavia. So, he's a person with an interesting background. But anyway, he has now come out and supported Macron's idea for the West to send troops to Ukraine. He acknowledges that those troops will not come from the United States. He accepts, he says, in a long article that he's written for Unheard, that the United States, with its commitment to facing off against China, where President Xi has just reminded Biden that for China, Taiwan is the first red line which mustn't be crossed, and that China will not sit on its hands if it is. Anyway, Edward Luttwak acknowledges that in the situation where the United States is caught up in a long-term conflict with China, the United States is not really in a position to contribute anything to any NATO expeditionary force to Ukraine. And about 2 weeks ago, he was writing in the Daily Telegraph about how European NATO armies are in no condition to take on the Russians. But nonetheless, that is what he recommends now that they should do. In this long article, there's a lengthy, I think tendentious discussion about why they shouldn't fear nuclear war, because supposedly nuclear weapons are so powerful that no country would ever use them in battle. That is the kind of dangerous proposition which only has to be proved wrong once for a catastrophe to unfold. Just saying. But anyway, he then goes on to say this: the arithmetic is inescapable. NATO countries will soon have to send soldiers to Ukraine or accept catastrophic defeat. The British and French, along with the Nordic countries, are already quietly preparing to send troops, both small elite units and logistics and support personnel, who can remain far from the front. The latter could play an essential role by releasing their Ukrainian counterparts for retraining in combat roles. NATO units could also relieve Ukrainians currently tied up in the recovery and repair of damaged equipment, and could take over the technical parts of existing training programs for new recruits. These NATO soldiers might never see combat, but they don't have to, in order to help Ukraine make the most of its own scarce manpower. And he then goes on to say a momentous decision is in the post for the other NATO members, especially the most populous: Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. If Europe cannot provide enough troops, Russia will prevail on the battlefield. And even if diplomacy successfully intervenes to avoid a complete debacle, Russian military power will have victoriously returned to Central Europe. At that point, Western European powers will have to rebuild their armed forces, whether they like it or not, starting with the return of compulsory military service. Well, the first thing to say is, it's interesting that he admits that if NATO doesn't send troops to Ukraine, then the war is lost. That there will be a complete defeat. He doesn't acknowledge that what has led to that defeat is a catastrophic series of misjudgments by the Western powers of Russian intentions and Russian concerns, and above all, of Russian capabilities. Nowhere does he admit that this has been the product of a catastrophic failure of Western policy. What he wants to do instead is to gamble more. He has put his chips on the wrong number. He's lost and stands to be wiped out entirely. But what he wants to do is to put all the remaining chips that he has, every last one, on that same number and stake it all on the next turn of the wheel. I don't think this is any kind of policy. I think this is a disastrous idea. However bad the consequences of a military defeat in Ukraine are, how much worse will they be if NATO troops go to Ukraine and Ukraine is defeated? Which, on his own admission of the state of NATO militaries, would be the case. And of course, if things escalate and we do get into a World War III situation and the Americans do become involved, I, for one, do not want to have to risk everything on his reassurances that nuclear war will never happen because the weapons involved are too powerful ever to be used. So, this seems to me not like a strategy, but an insane gamble. The act of a completely desperate person. Now, to reiterate again, the clear way forward is not to double down and triple down in the catastrophic way that Edward Luttwak says. The Russians have already said, if European troops, NATO troops, enter Ukraine, the Russians will attack them. There is no reason to think that that warning is not meant seriously. The idea that British and French and German troops can simply go into Ukraine and take over the duties that Ukrainian personnel in the rear are doing and that the Russians will leave them alone seems to me incredibly misguided. Rather than take these reckless, desperate steps, given that he acknowledges that total defeat is on the way, why not try to mitigate it by discussing with the Russians some real diplomatic alternative? Not a conflict freeze, a ridiculous idea, one that the Russians have understandably dismissed with derision, but a proper, realistic plan based on Russian interests, which the West should aim to try to find out, which might at least provide for some kind of cold peace in Europe, because that's all we're going to get. It's not for me to set out what the Russians would probably demand, but they would certainly demand full control of the 4 regions, protection for Russian speakers elsewhere in Ukraine. That might involve some kind of military presence by the Russians in places like Odessa and conceivably Kiev as well. Just saying, might not be an attractive thing to accept. The Russians will probably also insist on negotiations about a new security architecture in Europe. Serious negotiations, maybe based on their treaty, the one that they proposed in December 2021. Now, better perhaps, however unattractive all that is, for the West to accept that, also to accept that Ukraine isn't joining NATO, than to accept a catastrophic defeat. If the Russians win a complete victory in Ukraine, the Russian troops will be in Kiev and Odessa anyway. Better have them there, if that's what it takes, under some kind of treaty arrangement where their numbers and their role might be restricted, than to have the Russians able to operate them at will anywhere that they wish across Ukraine. And besides, there's Ukraine itself to consider, this tormented, shattered country. Surely it deserves peace, and if you want to preserve it, then negotiate now whilst there is still something left. Well, far better to do that, so it seems to me, than to go down these dangerous paths of discussing proposals for a conflict freeze the Russians are bound to reject, try to pressure the Chinese in a way that is only going to result in a pushback from the Chinese, or float dangerous, irresponsible ideas about sending Western troops to Ukraine, which can only make the situation far worse and at best lead to a more catastrophic defeat than the one the West is already facing. Well, I don't expect any of this to happen. My own personal view is that we're not going to get negotiations, at least not whilst the current administration is in office, not serious negotiations. All the indications are that the war is going to go on. The Russians will clear up Donbass, probably sometime in the summer. They will launch their offensive, their big offensive. There'll be the West will wring its hands. There'll be lots of distress and dismay and angry words, but the Russians will just probably steamroll further west until, at a time and place of their own choosing, they either stop or not. Perhaps they will move on all the way to the Polish border, who's to say. But anyway, I think myself increasingly that is the most likely outcome, the catastrophic defeat that Edward Luttwak is talking about. And look at the kind of stories we have in the Western media, which show us how difficult negotiation of any kind is going to be, how utterly paranoid the atmosphere in the West has now become. So in just a few days, I see that the Havana Syndrome story, utterly discredited as it was last year, the one that the Russians are using some mysterious acoustic device to cause ill health to American diplomats for no possible reason that I can see, even if such a technology existed, which it probably doesn't. Anyway, that utterly discredited story is now being revived, even though the news media outlets, Der Spiegel and the others, admit that they have no actual concrete evidence that it is being used. I read yesterday in the Daily Telegraph about how the Chinese might have created a new nightmare supercomputer based on quantum principles, which is busy hacking every single communication that the West has, except, of course, buried, squirreled in deep down inside the article, is the admission that the possibilities of that having actually happened are less than zero. That's what the article actually says. Then there's an article today in the Financial Times from the Czech publishing comments by the Czech transport minister, telling us that the Russians are to blame for the fact that in Central Europe the trains don't run on time. They are busy interfering with the signals and other things in the Central European railway network. Anybody who's had to use the German railways, for example, as I have frequently done over the last few years, knows that they are in a chaotic and desperate condition, and that it has nothing to do with the Russians, and it is a long-term problem. But anyway, we get story after story of this kind. They pile up all the time, reflecting the paranoia that exists now. How can we possibly have serious negotiations in a climate like this? The war, all the facts point, will go on. The Russians, of course, aware of everything, unwilling to take anything we say on trust, pressing on towards victory. Well, in my next program, I'm going to discuss President Biden's supposed ultimatum to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't think it's any kind of ultimatum myself, but this is how it's been reported. So that will be in my next program, always assuming that something else equally dramatic or more dramatic doesn't happen in the meantime. But this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you. More from me soon. Have a very good day.